I don't know if anyone's ever going to read this. Hell, I don't even know why I'm writing it down. Habit, maybe. Maybe guilt. 3 months ago, I thought I understood what I was getting into. Remote ranger station in the Yukon territory. Plenty of isolation, sure, but I'd done my research. Wildlife management, trail maintenance, the occasional lost hiker. Standard stuff. Nothing I couldn't handle with a forestry degree and common sense. Should have known better when they assigned Mario Thornton to train me. Mario had been working these woods for 30 years. 30 years of winters that could kill you in an hour and summers where the sun barely set. The kind of guy who could track a wounded moose through dense brush and tell you what it had for breakfast 2 days ago just by looking at the scat. I respected that. Figured I'd learn a lot from him. What I didn't expect was the way he'd go quiet sometimes. We'd be hiking a trail, checking for storm damage or marking trees that needed removal, and he'd just stop, stand there listening to something I couldn't hear. When I'd ask what was wrong, he'd shake his head and tell me it was nothing. But his eyes would scan the tree line like he was looking for something specific. The training went fine, mostly. Mario knew his stuff, and he was good at explaining the practical side of the job. Radio protocols, supply schedules, what to do if someone got hurt and the nearest hospital was 200 miles away. He showed me the best spots to watch for poachers and which trails got washed out every spring. Useful information. But there were other things. Little comments that didn't quite fit. He'd point out certain areas on the map and tell me to avoid them during specific times. Not because of wildlife activity or unstable terrain. Just avoid them. When I asked why, he'd change the subject. The whole thing felt off, but I figured every old-timer had their quirks. Maybe 30 years in the wilderness did that to you. Made you superstitious about things that couldn't hurt you. I was wrong about that too. Mario's last day of training was yesterday. We'd spent the morning going over the radio equipment one more time, making sure I knew how to reach the district office if something went wrong. The afternoon was supposed to be paperwork. Inventory reports, maintenance schedules, the kind of boring administrative stuff that keeps the bureaucrats happy. Instead, Mario spent most of it pacing around the cabin. He'd start to say something, then stop. Pick up his coffee mug, put it down without drinking, check the radio even though we'd just tested it an hour before. Finally, around 4 in the afternoon, he sat down across from me at the small wooden table we used for meals and paperwork, reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. It was folded small and creased like he'd been carrying it around for years. The edges were soft and worn, the kind of wear you get from handling something too much. "Need to give you this," he said. His voice had that gravelly quality it got when he was being serious about something. Mario wasn't much for small talk on a good day, but this was different, more careful, like he was choosing each word. I took the paper. It felt warm from being in his pocket, and when I unfolded it, I could see it was handwritten. Mario's handwriting, but neater than usual, like he'd taken his time with it. There were 6 items on the list, 6 rules written out in black ink that had faded a little over time. I read through them once, then again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The first rule was about voices. Don't answer voices calling your name in the dark, especially if you recognize them, even if they sound like someone you know, even if they sound distressed. I looked up at Mario. He was watching my face, waiting for my reaction. "What is this?" I asked. "Keep reading." The second rule was about lights. If you see lights moving through the forest at night, lights that don't belong to vehicles or campers, don't investigate. Don't even watch them. Go inside and stay there until morning. The third rule made even less sense. Don't look directly at anything that seems out of place during the new moon. If something catches your eye, something that shouldn't be there, look away immediately and leave the area. I was starting to think this was some kind of joke. Maybe a tradition for new rangers, something to mess with the rookie. But Mario's expression didn't change. He just sat there, hands folded on the table, waiting for me to finish. The fourth rule was about finding things. If you discover personal belongings in the woods, things that look like they've been there a long time, don't touch them. Mark the location and report it, but don't move anything. The fifth rule was about sounds. If you hear music or laughter coming from empty areas, especially areas where people have gone missing, turn around and leave immediately. Don't try to find the source. The sixth and final rule was the strangest one. If someone approaches you claiming to be lost or injured, but something feels wrong about them, trust that feeling. Help them if you can, but don't let them into the cabin and don't give them specific information about your location or schedule. I set the paper down and stared at it for a moment. The whole thing read like something out of a campfire story. The kind of nonsense people made up to scare each other in the dark. "Mario?" I said. "What the hell is this?" He leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked under his weight, and for the first time since I'd known him, Mario looked old, really old. Not just weathered from years outdoors, but tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "Those are the rules," he said, "for staying alive out here." I almost laughed. Would have, if not for the look on his face. Mario was serious. Dead serious. "Come on," I said. "You're telling me you believe this stuff? I'm telling you to follow it." The way he said it made me stop. There was something in his voice I hadn't heard before. Not exactly fear, but close. Respect, maybe. The kind of respect you show to something dangerous. "Mario, this is crazy?" He nodded. "Yeah, I know how it sounds. Thought the same thing when Peterson gave me that list 30 years ago. Figured the old bastard had finally lost it." Peterson. I'd heard the name before. Mario's predecessor, the ranger who'd worked this station before him. Died of a heart attack about 6 months after he retired. Natural causes, according to the file. "But you kept it," I said, holding up the paper. "I kept it because it works." Mario's voice was flat, matter of fact. "Follow those rules, and you'll make it through your first year. Maybe longer." I looked at the list again. The handwriting was definitely Mario's, but now I was wondering if the words were his. Maybe this was something that got passed down from ranger to ranger, copied and recopied over the years. "How many people have had this?" I asked. "Everyone who's worked this station since 1973. That was when the station was built. I'd read about it in the orientation materials. Remote monitoring post, established to help track wildlife populations and forest health in an area too isolated for regular patrols. And they all followed these rules? The ones who lived did." The words hit me wrong. I set the paper down harder than I meant to. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mario was quiet for a long moment. He got up from the table and walked over to the window, looking out at the dense forest that surrounded our cabin. The trees were thick here, old growth that blocked out most of the sky. Even in daylight, the spaces between the trunks looked dark. "Had a ranger here in '87, he said finally. "Young guy about your age. Smart, college educated, thought he knew better." Mario's reflection was visible in the window glass, and I could see his face in profile. The deep lines around his eyes, the way his mouth was set in a hard line. "What happened to him? Found his body 3 months into winter. Froze to death about 2 miles from the cabin." That didn't sound particularly unusual. People died in the wilderness all the time. Hypothermia, accidents, getting lost. It was part of the job description. "Could have been anything," I said. "Equipment failure, medical emergency. Could have been." Mario turned back to face me. "Except he left the cabin in the middle of the night. Middle of a blizzard. No gear, no jacket. Just walked out into the storm in his underwear." I didn't have an answer for that. People did strange things sometimes, especially when they were isolated for long periods. Cabin fever, depression, mental breaks. It happened. "The rules would have saved him," Mario said. He walked back to the table and sat down again, picked up the paper and smoothed it out with his fingers. "Look, I know how this sounds. Believe me, I know. But I've been out here for 30 years and I've seen things that don't make sense. Things that don't fit into your college textbooks or government manuals. Mario's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something that made me pay attention despite myself. What kind of things? The kind you don't talk about. The kind that make people think you're crazy if you try to explain them. He folded the paper back up, but instead of putting it in his pocket, he slid it across the table to me. "I'm not asking you to believe me," he said. "I'm asking you to follow the rules, all of them, exactly as they're written. Don't try to test them or figure out why they work. Just follow them." I picked up the paper. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of something denser than ordinary paper. "And if I don't?" Mario's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Something that made me think of the way he'd go quiet on the trails, listening for sounds I couldn't hear. "Then you'll find out why they exist." We sat there in silence for a while. Outside, the wind was picking up, making the trees creak and sway. The cabin felt smaller somehow, more isolated, like the forest was pressing in around us. Finally, Mario stood up. "I'm heading out first thing tomorrow," he said. "Early, probably before you're awake." I nodded. We'd already gone over the transition schedule. Mario would drive back to Whitehorse, then fly south to spend his retirement somewhere warmer, somewhere with more people and fewer trees. "Any last-minute advice?" I asked. Mario paused in the doorway, his hand on the frame. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something else about the rules, something that would make them seem less crazy. Instead, he just looked at me, really looked at me, like he was trying to memorize my face. "You think I'm crazy," he said. It wasn't a question. "I think you've been out here a long time." Mario nodded slowly. "That's good," he said. "Means you're still normal. When things start happening, and they will, remember that I warned you." He left me alone with the list and a growing sense that I'd just agreed to something I didn't understand. The paper sat on the table in front of me, 6 simple rules written in fading ink. I read through them one more time before folding the paper and putting it in my pocket. It felt warm against my chest, and I found myself wondering how many other rangers had carried these same words into the wilderness. Tomorrow, Mario would be gone. Tomorrow, I'd be alone out here with whatever had put those lines on his face and that careful tone in his voice. I looked out the window at the darkening forest and tried not to think about voices calling names in the dark. I woke up that morning thinking I had this whole thing figured out. 3 weeks I'd been out here on my own, and honestly, it wasn't bad at all. The work kept me busy during the day, checking trail markers, updating wildlife counts, maintaining the equipment. I'd gotten into a rhythm that felt good. Coffee at 6, radio check with the district office at 7, then out into the forest until late afternoon. Evenings I'd catch up on paperwork, read, maybe call Steven if I could get a decent signal. The isolation that Mario had made sound so ominous turned out to be peaceful, quiet in a way you can't get in the city. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no constant hum of civilization. Just me and the trees and the sound of wind moving through branches. I'd stopped thinking about Mario's rules. Not completely, but they'd faded into background noise. The folded paper was still in my jacket pocket, but I hadn't looked at it in over a week. The whole thing felt like the paranoid ramblings of an old man who'd spent too many years alone in the wilderness. 30 years out here would make anyone see things that weren't there, hear things that didn't exist. I mean, voices calling your name in the dark. Come on. That's the kind of thing your brain invents when you're isolated and stressed, and the rest of the rules weren't much better. Don't look at lights in the forest. Don't touch old belongings. Don't let suspicious people into the cabin. It all sounded like campfire stories designed to spook the new guy. The work itself was exactly what I'd expected when I applied for the position. Standard ranger duties. I'd tracked a family of black bears that had been getting too comfortable near the main hiking trail, relocated them deeper into the forest without incident, fixed 3 damaged trail markers where winter weather had knocked them loose, documented a beaver dam that was backing up water near the access road. Normal stuff that matched everything I'd learned in forestry school. I was feeling pretty good about myself, actually. Competent, like I'd figured out how to handle this job without all the weird superstitions that had apparently spooked Mario into early retirement. That night started like any other. I'd spent the day checking the northern boundary markers, a long hike that took me about 8 miles out and back. My legs were tired in that good way that comes from a full day of walking, and I was looking forward to dinner and maybe getting through another chapter of the book I'd been reading. Something about sustainable forestry practices that was drier than it sounded but relevant to the work. I heated up a can of chili on the propane stove and ate it with some crackers while going over my notes from the day. Everything looked normal. Wildlife activity was typical for the season. No signs of poaching or unauthorized camping. Trails in good condition. I wrote up a brief report for the district office and set it aside to radio in the next morning. It was just past 9 when I heard my name. I was washing my bowl in the small sink, thinking about whether I had enough energy to read or if I should just go to bed early, when the voice drifted through the darkness outside. Dylan. Clear as anything, soft but distinct, coming from somewhere near the tree line, maybe 50 yards from the cabin. I stopped scrubbing the bowl and listened. The voice had sounded familiar, though I couldn't place it immediately. Someone who knew me well enough to use my first name, but I hadn't told anyone my exact location except the district office, and they wouldn't send someone out here without radioing first. Dylan, you there? There it was again. Closer this time, maybe 30 yards out. And now I recognized the voice. Stephen, my younger brother's voice, unmistakable. The same tone he'd used when we were kids and he wanted something from me. Casual, but with an edge of urgency underneath. But Stephen was in Vancouver, 2,000 miles away, working his accounting job and living in a downtown apartment that he complained about constantly. There was no way he could be standing in the forest outside my cabin at 9 o'clock at night. I set the bowl down and moved toward the window, but the glass just showed me my own reflection against the darkness outside. The single overhead light in the cabin made it impossible to see anything beyond the glass. Dylan, come on. I know you're in there. The voice was definitely Stephen's. Same inflection, same slight impatience that he got when he thought I was ignoring him. But something about it felt wrong. Too clear, maybe. Sound doesn't carry that well through forest, especially with all the trees between the cabin and wherever the voice was coming from. I found myself walking toward the door. My hand was actually reaching for the handle when Mario's words came flooding back. The first rule, the one he'd emphasized most strongly: don't answer voices calling your name in the dark, even if you recognize them. I stopped with my fingers inches from the door handle. The voice came again, more insistent now. Dylan, I'm lost out here. I need help. Lost. That made sense, sort of. Stephen could have been driving up to surprise me, gotten turned around on the access roads. They weren't well marked, and GPS was unreliable out here. It wouldn't be the first time someone had gotten confused trying to find the station. But how would he have gotten past the locked gate at the main road? And why would he be hiking through the forest instead of staying with his car? Please, Dylan. I've been walking for hours. The desperation in the voice was perfect, exactly how Stephen would sound if he was really lost and scared. My brother had never been comfortable in the wilderness. He was a city person through and through, the kind who got nervous if he couldn't see streetlights. If he was really out there alone in the dark, he'd be terrified. I took a step toward the door. Then I stopped and forced myself to think. Stephen didn't even know exactly where I was working. I'd told him I'd gotten a ranger position in Yukon territory, but I hadn't given him specific coordinates or directions to the station. Hell, I'd barely figured out how to find this place myself when I first arrived. And Stephen would have called first. He wasn't the type to just show up unannounced, especially not after a 2,000-mile drive through wilderness he didn't understand. "Dylan, why won't you answer me? I can see the light in your cabin." The voice was getting angry now, frustrated, and that sounded like Stephen too. He'd always had a short temper when things didn't go his way, but the more I listened, the more something felt off about it. The voice was too consistent, too clear. Real voices change when people are tired or stressed or walking through rough terrain. They get hoarse or breathless or strained. This voice sounded exactly the same each time, like a recording played at different volumes. I stepped away from the door. Instead of opening it, I reached for the light switch and turned off the cabin's overhead light. The room went dark, and suddenly I could see out the windows. The forest looked empty, just the pale shapes of tree trunks in the moonlight and the dark spaces between them where anything could be hiding. I couldn't see anyone moving out there, but that didn't mean much. The trees provided plenty of cover. "Dylan, please, I'm hurt." Now the voice claimed injury. Of course it did. The perfect escalation to make me feel guilty for not responding. Stephen hurt and alone in the forest while I stood safe in my cabin, too paranoid to help my own brother. Except it wasn't my brother. I was sure of that now. Not because of anything logical I could point to, but because something deep in my gut was screaming that this was wrong. The voice was too perfect, too precisely calibrated to get an emotional response from me. Real people don't sound like that when they're lost and scared and hurt. I sat down in one of the cabin's 2 chairs and waited. "Dylan, I know you can hear me. Why won't you help me?" The voice had moved. Now it was coming from the other side of the cabin, near the back window, which meant whatever was making that sound had circled around the building while I was standing in the dark. Stephen would have just walked up to the front door and knocked. He wouldn't be skulking around in the trees playing games. "Please, Dylan, I'm bleeding. I fell and I think I broke something." The desperation was ramping up. More emotion, more urgency. But underneath it, I was starting to hear something else. A kind of artificial quality, like the voice was being projected rather than spoken naturally. I stayed in my chair and kept my mouth shut. For the next 2 hours, the voice kept calling. Sometimes it was pleading, begging me to come outside and help. Sometimes it was angry, demanding to know why I was ignoring my own brother. Sometimes it was sobbing, claiming to be dying alone in the cold. The emotional range was incredible. Perfect, really. Every possible variation designed to make me feel guilty or scared or responsible, but that's exactly what made it so obviously fake. Real people don't cycle through emotions like that. Real people get tired or give up or find some other solution. This thing just kept going, relentless and patient and completely inhuman in its persistence. Around midnight, the voice changed tactics. "I know you're scared, Dylan. I know someone told you not to trust voices in the dark, but it's really me. Ask me something only Stephen would know." That was clever and terrifying, because it meant whatever was out there had been listening to my thoughts, or at least guessing them accurately. But I didn't say anything, didn't ask any questions, because I was pretty sure that whatever was calling my name could answer them correctly. It had Stephen's voice down perfectly. It probably had access to Stephen's memories too, somehow. The voice kept trying different approaches. It claimed to be injured in increasingly creative ways. It got angry and accused me of being a coward. It sobbed and pleaded and bargained. Around 2 a.m, it started getting really creative. "Dylan, there's something following me out here. Something in the trees. Please let me in." Now it was trying to flip the script. Instead of being the thing I should be afraid of, it was claiming to be afraid of something else. trying to position itself as the victim that needed protection. I almost laughed. Almost. But there was something so calculating about the approach that it killed any urge to find it funny. This thing was intelligent. It was studying my responses, or lack of responses, and adapting its strategy accordingly. That was a lot more disturbing than simple mimicry. "It's getting closer, Dylan. Please, I don't want to die out here." The fear in the voice was perfect, absolutely convincing. If I hadn't already figured out what was happening, I might have believed it, but I stayed in my chair and waited for dawn. The voice kept calling until the sky started getting light around 6. Then it just stopped. No final plea, no dramatic exit. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. I waited another hour before I got up and looked out the windows. The forest looked normal, peaceful even, just trees and snow and the kind of quiet you only get in deep wilderness. But I needed to be sure. I put on my boots and jacket and went outside to check the snow around the cabin. If someone had really been walking around out there for hours, there would be tracks. Lots of them. The snow was completely undisturbed. No footprints anywhere near the cabin. No sign that anyone had been walking through the forest, circling the building, moving from spot to spot while the voice called my name. I walked a complete perimeter around the cabin, then expanded my search out to the tree line. Nothing. The snow showed rabbit tracks, some bird prints, the trail I'd made coming back from yesterday's patrol, but no human footprints anywhere. Whatever had been calling my name all night, it hadn't been walking on the ground. I went back inside and made coffee with hands that were shaking just a little bit. Then I sat down at the table and pulled Mario's list out of my pocket. Rule number 1. Don't answer voices calling your name in the dark, even if you recognize them. I read it 3 times, thinking about how close I'd come to opening that door, how my hand had actually reached for the handle before Mario's warning stopped me. The old ranger hadn't been paranoid or crazy. He'd been trying to keep me alive. I folded the paper carefully and put it back in my pocket. This time, I wasn't going to forget about it. This time I was going to take every single rule seriously, because now I knew that whatever had written those rules was still out there in the forest, still calling names in the dark, still waiting for someone stupid enough to answer. I sat there drinking my coffee and watching the sunrise through the cabin window. The forest looked beautiful and peaceful, but I wasn't fooled anymore. Something was out there, something that knew my name and my brother's voice and exactly which emotional buttons to push. And now it knew I was here. 2 weeks went by without anything else happening. I'd started to think maybe whatever had called to me that night was a one-time thing. Maybe it had moved on to bother someone else, or maybe it just got bored when I didn't take the bait. I should have known better. The evening patrol had become part of my routine. Every day around 4:30, I'd grab my pack and head out to check the northern boundary markers. It was a good 3-mile loop that took me through some of the denser sections of forest, past the old logging road that hadn't been used in probably 15 years, and along the creek that ran down from the mountains. Mario had shown me the route during training, though he'd never mentioned anything unusual about it. Just standard boundary maintenance, he'd said. Keep an eye out for poachers, check for damaged markers, make sure nobody was setting up illegal camps. That particular evening was colder than it had been. The snow crunched under my boots with that sharp sound you only get when the temperature drops below 0. My breath came out in white puffs that hung in the still air for a few seconds before disappearing. The sun was already getting low, casting long shadows between the trees. I'd need to keep a good pace if I wanted to finish the loop before full dark. I was about 2 miles into the patrol, just past the old logging road when I saw them. At first I thought it was just sunlight reflecting off ice. You see that sometimes in winter, the way light catches on frozen branches or icicles and throws these bright flashes through the forest. But this was different. The light was coming from too deep in the woods, and it was the wrong color. Instead of the warm orange glow of late afternoon sun, this was blue-white, cold and electric. I stopped walking and squinted into the trees. The light flickered, disappeared for a second, then came back stronger. It pulsed like a heartbeat, dim, then bright, then dim again. And it was moving. Not moving like a flashlight beam sweeping back and forth. Moving like it was alive. Like it was floating between the trees, weaving through the forest with purpose. The glow would brighten around one tree, then fade and reappear 20 feet away around another one. Sometimes it split into two separate lights, then merged back together. Sometimes it stretched out long and thin like a ribbon before contracting back into a single point. I'd never seen anything like it. My first thought was that someone was back there with some kind of equipment. Maybe researchers studying something, or kids playing around with glow sticks or LED lights. But we were miles from the nearest road, and the snow was knee-deep in places. Nobody would hike that far into the forest just to mess around with lights. And besides, the way the light moved didn't look like anything man-made. It flowed too smoothly, changed direction too quickly. It looked organic somehow, like bioluminescence you'd see in deep ocean creatures. The lights pulsed brighter, and I felt something strange happen in my chest. A pulling sensation, like someone had tied a rope around my ribs and was tugging gently. The lights seemed to beckon, drawing my attention deeper into the forest. I found myself taking a step off the trail toward them. They were beautiful, I had to admit, mesmerizing in a way that made it hard to look away. The blue-white glow was so pure, so clean, compared to the gray shadows of the winter forest. It reminded me of pictures I'd seen of the northern lights, that same ethereal quality that made you feel like you were witnessing something magical, something beyond normal human experience. I took another step toward the trees. The snow was deeper here, but that didn't matter. I needed to get closer. I needed to see what was creating that incredible light. Maybe it was some kind of rare atmospheric phenomenon, something that would be worth documenting. Or maybe it was wildlife, some species I'd never encountered before. Either way, I had to investigate. That was part of my job, wasn't it? To observe and report unusual activity in the forest? The pulling sensation in my chest got stronger. The lights pulsed faster, almost urgently, like they were trying to communicate something, like they wanted me to follow them. I pushed through a cluster of low pine branches, feeling the snow cascade down the back of my neck. The lights were maybe 100 yards away now, still moving between the trees, but staying in roughly the same area, waiting for me. I was halfway to them when Mario's voice cut through my thoughts like a cold blade. Don't investigate or watch unexplained lights moving through the forest at night. Rule number 2. I stopped so abruptly that I nearly lost my balance in the deep snow. The paper in my jacket pocket suddenly felt warm against my chest, like it was trying to remind me of something important, something I'd almost forgotten in my fascination with the lights. What the hell was I doing? I looked around and realized I was at least 50 yards off the patrol trail, standing waist-deep in snow between trees I didn't recognize. The lights were still there, still pulsing, but now they seemed different somehow, less beautiful and more predatory, like they'd been luring me deeper into the forest on purpose. The pulling sensation in my chest hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now, almost painful in its intensity. Part of me still wanted to keep going, to see what was making those lights. But a bigger part of me was starting to understand that Mario's rules weren't just paranoid ramblings from an old man. They were survival instructions. And I'd almost broken the second one. I forced myself to turn around and start walking back toward the trail. It was harder than it should have been, like I was walking through thick mud instead of snow. Every step away from the lights felt wrong, like I was abandoning something important. The pulling sensation in my chest became a sharp ache that made it difficult to breathe. Behind me, the lights pulsed brighter. I could see the glow reflecting off the snow around my feet, casting blue-white shadows between the trees. They were following me. I didn't look back. I kept my eyes fixed on the patrol trail ahead and concentrated on putting one foot in front of the other. The snow crunched under my boots with that same sharp sound, but now it seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. Every step echoed like a gunshot. The lights stayed with me as I made my way back to the trail. I could see them in my peripheral vision, moving parallel to my path about 30 yards to the left. They no longer pulsed randomly. Now they flashed in a steady rhythm, like a signal, like they were trying to get my attention. The blue-white glow painted the trees around me in stark, alien colors that made the familiar forest look like the surface of some distant planet. When I reached the patrol trail, I turned north and picked up my pace. The lights followed, staying just beyond the tree line. Sometimes they'd move ahead of me. Sometimes they'd fall behind. But they never got closer than 20 yards and they never disappeared entirely. It was like being escorted by something that wanted me to know it was there. The ache in my chest gradually faded as I put distance between myself and wherever the lights had first appeared. But the pulling sensation never went away completely. Even now, walking along the familiar trail with my back to the forest, I could feel the lights behind me, feel them watching, feel them waiting for me to turn around and look. I didn't turn around. The trail curved east about a mile later, following the creek bed down toward the cabin. The light stayed with me until the very last bend, then suddenly winked out like someone had thrown a switch. 1 second they were there, casting their cold glow between the trees, and the next second the forest was dark again, normal, like nothing had happened. But I could still feel them out there. Still feel that faint tugging sensation in my chest, like an invisible thread connecting me to something in the deep woods. Something that knew I'd almost followed its lights. Something that would remember. I finished the patrol at a near jog, checking the last few boundary markers as quickly as possible before heading back to the cabin. By the time I got there, full dark had settled over the forest and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. I locked the door behind me, started a fire in the wood stove, and made myself a pot of coffee with hands that shook slightly as I measured out the grounds. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those blue-white lights pulsing in the darkness behind my eyelids. Every sound from the forest outside made me sit up and listen, but nothing called my name. Nothing approached the cabin. Whatever those lights had been, they seemed content to wait. The next morning I woke up before dawn, made coffee and waited for enough light to see by. I needed to go back to where I'd first spotted the lights. I needed to see if there was any evidence of what had been out there. The patrol trail was easy to follow in daylight, and it didn't take long to find the spot where I'd left it the night before. My footprints were still visible in the snow, a clear trail leading from the path into the deeper forest and back again. I followed them carefully, noting how they wandered at first, then became more direct as I'd gotten closer to wherever the lights had been. The prints led me through the cluster of pine branches I remembered pushing through, past a fallen log I'd stepped over, around a boulder that had scraped against my jacket. Everything looked different in daylight, smaller, less mysterious. Just ordinary forest with ordinary trees and ordinary rocks. Nothing that would explain the lights I'd seen. But when I reached the area where the lights had been brightest, where they'd seemed to be waiting for me, I found something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the snow, human footprints. At first glance they looked normal, the right size for an adult, the right general shape. Someone had been walking around in this area recently, maybe within the last day or two. But the more I looked at them, the more wrong they seemed. The prints were too long, for one thing. At least 2 inches longer than they should have been for the width. And the toe impressions were strange, too pointed, too spread out. like whoever had made them had toes that were longer and more widely spaced than normal human toes. The heel marks were deep and narrow, and there were what looked like claw marks at the front of each print. But the strangest thing was the spacing. The prints were too far apart, like whoever had made them had a stride that was just slightly too long for their foot size. Not enough to be obvious at first, but enough to make the pattern look off when you really studied it. I followed the trail of prints for about 20 yards. They wandered in a rough circle around the area where I'd seen the lights, sometimes overlapping, sometimes doubling back on themselves. Like whatever had made them had been pacing or dancing. The prints were clearest in the deeper snow, but I could make out faint impressions even in the areas where the snow was thinner. Then, right in the center of the circle, the prints just stopped. Not like whoever had made them had walked away in a direction I couldn't follow. They literally ended. The last clear print was in a patch of deep, undisturbed snow, and there was nothing beyond it. No scuff marks, no partial impressions, no sign that anything had continued walking in any direction. It was like whoever had been there had simply vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long time, staring at that last footprint. The snow around it was perfect, unmarked except for a few bird tracks and the scattered impressions where rabbits had hopped through. Nothing that could explain how something that had been walking around making clear prints in the snow could just disappear. Unless it hadn't been walking on the snow at all by the end. Unless it had been floating, or flying, or just gone. I thought about the lights I'd seen, the way they'd moved between the trees with that organic flowing motion, the way they'd pulsed and beckoned and followed me along the trail, the way they'd known exactly how to draw me off the path and into the deeper forest, the way they disappeared the moment I'd gotten far enough away. I looked at the footprints again, at their too long shape and wrong spacing, at the claw marks and the impossible ending, and I understood, with a clarity that made my stomach clench, that Mario's second rule had just saved my life. Whatever had been out here last night, whatever had made those lights and left those prints, it hadn't been human, and it had been trying very hard to get me to come closer. I turned around and walked back to the patrol trail without looking over my shoulder. But I could feel something watching me go, something that knew I'd seen its footprints and understood what they meant, something that would remember I'd almost followed its lights and would be waiting for another chance. The rules had saved me again, and now I was starting to understand that they weren't just warnings about strange things that might happen in the forest. They were instructions for staying alive in a place where things that weren't quite human walked around in the dark, leaving impossible footprints in the snow and calling to people with voices that sounded exactly like the people they loved most. The fog rolled in thick that morning, turning the forest into something you couldn't quite trust. I'd been out on patrol for maybe an hour, checking the remote trail markers on the eastern boundary. It was the kind of weather that made everything look different. Trees appearing and disappearing like ghosts, the whole world reduced to maybe 20 feet of visibility in any direction. I should have turned back. Protocol said to avoid extended patrols in heavy fog, and I could hear Mario's voice in my head telling me not to take unnecessary risks. But I'd been cooped up in the cabin for 3 days straight while a storm system moved through, and I needed to get out. Needed to feel like I was doing the job I'd been hired for, not just sitting around thinking about voices in the dark and lights that moved between trees. The temperature had dropped to maybe 15 below, and my breath came out in thick clouds that mixed with the fog and made visibility even worse. Every step crunched loud in the snow, and the sound seemed to get swallowed up immediately, like the fog was eating it. I'd been following the trail markers, checking each one to make sure they were still secure after the storm, when I saw something that made me stop walking. There was a figure in the clearing ahead. At first I thought it was just another tree, or maybe a shadow playing tricks in the fog. But as I stood there squinting through the gray, I could make out the shape more clearly. It was small, too small to be an adult, and it was standing perfectly still in the middle of the clearing, maybe 40 yards away from where I'd stopped. My first thought was that some kid had gotten lost, maybe wandered away from a camping family, though what kind of parents would bring a child out here in weather like this was beyond me. The nearest road was 12 miles away, and there weren't any cabins or hunting lodges in this section of the forest. But there it was. Definitely a child, standing there in what looked like a bright red winter coat. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a better look. The fog shifted and swirled, sometimes blocking my view completely, then clearing just enough to show me that small figure again. It hadn't moved, not even a little, just standing there in the snow like it was waiting for something. "Hey," I called out. "You okay over there?" My voice echoed weird in the fog, flatter than it should have been. The figure didn't respond, didn't turn toward me or wave or give any sign that it had heard me at all. It just kept standing there, perfectly still. I started walking toward it, my boots crunching through the snow. Every instinct I had was telling me to hurry, to get to that kid and figure out what the hell was going on. A child standing alone in the middle of nowhere, in fog this thick, in temperatures that could kill you if you weren't dressed right. This was exactly the kind of emergency situation I'd been trained for. But something made me slow down when I got maybe 20 yards closer. Something about the way the figure was standing, too still, too perfect, like a statue. That's when Mario's rules came back to me. Rule number 3, don't look directly at out-of-place objects during new moons. I stopped walking and pulled out my phone to check the date. My hands were shaking a little, whether from cold or something else I wasn't sure. The screen lit up and showed me what I already suspected. We were 3 days past the new moon. Close enough to count, according to what Mario had told me about not testing the rules or trying to find loopholes. The figure was definitely out of place. A child in a red coat, standing motionless in a remote clearing with no tracks leading to where it stood, because now that I was closer, I could see the snow around it. Pristine, undisturbed, like the figure had just appeared there without walking through the snow to get there. I backed up a few steps and reached for my radio. My hands were definitely shaking now, and it took me 2 tries to get the right channel. "Base, this is Wallace. I've got a situation on the eastern boundary trail." Static crackled for a few seconds before Catherine's voice came through. "Go ahead, Wallace. I've got what appears to be a lost child in the clearing near Marker 17. Requesting backup and search and rescue coordination." "Copy that. Can you confirm the child's condition?" I looked toward the figure again. Still hadn't moved. Still standing in that exact same position like it had been frozen there. "Negative on condition assessment. Subject is approximately 40 yards away and not responding to verbal contact. Visibility is severely limited due to fog." "Understood. Maintain visual contact but do not approach until backup arrives. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Copy." I clipped the radio back to my belt and settled in to wait. 90 minutes was a long time to stand in fog this thick, in cold this bitter, but I wasn't about to leave a child out here alone. Even if something about the whole situation felt wrong in ways I couldn't quite put my finger on. The fog kept shifting, sometimes giving me a clear view of the figure, sometimes blocking it completely. But every time the fog cleared enough for me to see, the child was in exactly the same position. Same posture, same angle, like it hadn't moved so much as an inch in all the time I'd been watching. I started timing it. Every time I could see the figure clearly, I'd check my watch. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. Not once did I see any movement, no shifting weight from foot to foot, no turning of the head, no sign that it was even breathing. That's what really started to get to me, the breathing, or lack of it. Even in cold like this, you'd see vapor clouds from exhaled breath. I was putting out thick white puffs every few seconds, and they were visible even in the fog. But from the direction of the child, nothing. No breath clouds at all. I tried calling out again. "Hey, can you hear me? I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help." Nothing. No response. No acknowledgement. The figure just kept standing there like it was made of stone. By the time I'd been watching for 30 minutes, I was starting to understand that whatever I was looking at, it probably wasn't a lost child. The complete lack of movement, the absence of breath vapor, the undisturbed snow around it, none of that added up to a living person who'd gotten separated from their family. But it looked like a child. Every time the fog cleared enough for me to get a good view, I could see the details clearly. Small frame, maybe 8 years old, red winter coat with a hood, dark pants, boots. If I hadn't been paying attention to all the things that were wrong about the situation, I would have sworn it was just a scared kid who needed help. And that's what would have gotten me. The natural instinct to help, to rush forward and scoop up a child who was obviously in danger, obviously needed assistance. If I hadn't been carrying Mario's rules in my pocket, if I hadn't spent the last few weeks learning to question things that seemed normal but weren't quite right, I would have walked straight into that clearing without hesitation. The thought of what might have happened if I'd done that made my stomach twist up, because whatever was standing in that clearing, it wasn't there by accident. It was positioned perfectly to be seen from the trail, positioned to trigger exactly the response it had triggered in me, the urgent need to help someone who appeared to be in distress. It was bait, and I'd almost taken it. I checked my watch again. 40 minutes since I'd called it in. The fog was getting thicker, if that was possible, and I was losing visual contact more frequently. Sometimes I'd go 5 or 10 minutes without being able to see the figure at all. Then the fog would shift, and there it would be again. Same position. Same perfect stillness. My radio crackled. "Wallace, this is base. What's your current status?" Still maintaining visual contact intermittently. Subject has not moved from original position. "Copy that. Be advised that weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. If visibility drops below safe levels, you are authorized to return to base and will resume search efforts when conditions improve." I was about to respond when the fog thickened suddenly, like someone had drawn a curtain across the clearing. 1 second, I could see the figure clearly. The next second, I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The whole world went gray and white and empty. I waited, checked my watch. The fog stayed thick for maybe 3 minutes, which was longer than the usual shifts I'd been seeing. When it finally started to clear, I focused on the spot where the figure had been standing. Nothing. The clearing was empty. Just undisturbed snow and a few scattered pine trees emerging from the fog like they'd always been there. No red coat, no small figure, no sign that anything had ever been standing in that spot. I waited another few minutes, thinking maybe the fog was still playing tricks on my eyes. But as visibility improved, it became clear that whatever I'd been watching for the last 45 minutes had simply vanished. I walked to the edge of the clearing, staying on the packed trail, and looked at the snow where the figure had been standing, smooth and white and untouched. No footprints leading in or out, no depressions where someone might have been standing. No sign that anything had disturbed the snow at all. My radio crackled again. "Wallace, what's your status?" I looked at the empty clearing one more time, then keyed the radio. "Base. This is Wallace. The subject is no longer visible. I'm going to do a perimeter search and then return to base. Copy that. Report back when you're clear of the area." I did a quick walk around the clearing's edge, staying on solid ground and checking for any tracks or signs. Found nothing. Whatever had been standing there had left no more trace of its presence than the lights in the forest or the voice that had called my name in the dark. The fog was starting to lift as I headed back toward the cabin, and I could feel something watching me from the trees. Not threatening exactly, more like curious. Like something was trying to figure out why I hadn't taken the bait it had offered. I pulled Mario's list out of my pocket and read rule number 3 again. Don't look directly at out-of-place objects during new moons. I'd followed the rule, mostly. I'd looked at the figure, but I hadn't approached it, hadn't touched it. Hadn't let my natural helping instincts override the warning Mario had left for me. And because of that, I was walking back to my cabin instead of disappearing into the fog like God knows how many other people who'd seen a child in distress and done exactly what any decent person would do. The rules weren't just protecting me from the things in the forest. They were protecting me from myself, from the parts of human nature that made us want to help, to investigate, to reach out to others who seemed to need assistance. Those instincts were good in the normal world. Out here, they'd get you killed. I radioed base to confirm I was clear of the area, then walked the rest of the way back in silence. The fog was lifting completely now, and I could see the forest clearly for the first time all morning. It looked normal, peaceful even, like nothing strange had ever happened there at all. The trail looked the same as always when I started my patrol that morning. Early December had settled into the forest with that particular kind of cold that made everything sharp and clear. The snow crunched under my boots in a steady rhythm, and my breath came out in white puffs that disappeared into the still air. I'd walked this same route probably 200 times since Mario left, maybe more. I knew every tree, every bend, every rock formation along the way. That's what made it so strange when I noticed the pine tree. It was about 50 yards ahead, standing just off the trail where it always stood. Big tree, probably 80 feet tall, with that distinctive double fork about 20 feet up that I'd been using as a landmark for months. But something felt different about it today. Not wrong exactly, just off. I kept walking, my eyes fixed on the path ahead like they always were. Standard patrol protocol. Watch for trail damage, broken markers, animal signs, the usual stuff. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed about that tree. When I looked up again, the tree was in a different spot. Not dramatically different, maybe a foot to the left of where it had been. But I'd been staring at that double fork for months, using it to gauge my distance to the creek crossing just beyond. I knew exactly where it was supposed to be. I stopped walking and stood there in the snow, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that I'd learned to recognize over the past couple months. The same feeling I'd gotten when I heard Stephen's voice outside my cabin, the same pulling sensation I'd felt when those blue lights were moving through the trees. The tree looked normal, just a big pine tree covered in snow, standing where pine trees stand. But it wasn't where it was supposed to be. I started walking again, slower this time, keeping my eyes on the trail but watching the tree in my peripheral vision. That's when I saw it move again. A subtle shift, like it was adjusting its position. Maybe another foot to the left, then back toward the right. Not swaying in the wind, there wasn't any wind that morning. Moving. Deliberate, careful movement, like it was trying not to be noticed. My first instinct was to stop and stare directly at it, figure out what the hell I was seeing. That's what any normal person would do, right? You see something impossible, you look at it head on until you can make sense of it or convince yourself you're imagining things. But I'd learned not to trust my normal instincts out here. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the warm paper of Mario's rules. I didn't need to unfold it to remember what it said. Rule number 3. Don't look directly at out-of-place objects during new moons. We were past the new moon now, but the rule felt relevant anyway. Don't look directly at things that shouldn't be moving. So, I didn't look directly at it. Instead, I kept the tree at the edge of my vision and continued walking. It was harder than it sounds. Every part of my brain was screaming at me to turn my head and focus on the thing that was clearly not behaving like a tree should behave. But I'd learned to listen to Mario's rules instead of my brain. The tree kept moving, small adjustments, like it was repositioning itself. Sometimes it would shift left, sometimes right. Sometimes it seemed to lean forward slightly. Always subtle, always just enough to make me question what I was seeing. But I was seeing it. I was absolutely certain of that. I thought about the footprints I'd found after the lights, The way they'd formed that circle in the snow, then just stopped. No explanation for how whatever made them had left the area. I thought about the figure in the red coat that had stood motionless for 45 minutes, then vanished when the fog cleared. This felt different, though, more patient, like whatever was happening with the tree was a longer game than the other encounters. The voice outside my cabin had been urgent, demanding. The lights had been actively trying to lure me off the trail. The figure had been positioned to trigger my rescue instincts immediately. This was subtler, more careful. I was maybe 30 yards away from the tree now, still walking at my normal pace, still keeping it in my peripheral vision, still watching it make those small, deliberate movements. That's when I realized what it was doing. It was trying to get me to look directly at it. Each movement was calculated to catch my attention, to make me turn my head and focus. It was like watching someone wave at you from across the street. Your natural response is to look right at them, make eye contact, acknowledge what you're seeing. But I kept my eyes on the trail and let the tree stay at the edge of my vision. The movements became more pronounced, not dramatic, but more frequent. A lean to the left, then back to center. A slight rotation, like it was turning to face me as I approached, still subtle enough that I could convince myself I was imagining it if I wanted to. But I wasn't imagining it. 20 yards away now. The tree was definitely bigger than I'd thought. Taller, thicker around the trunk. The double fork looked different too, more angular somehow. Like the branches had rearranged themselves into a shape that was almost familiar but not quite right. I thought about what Mario had said about the rules, how they weren't suggestions or guidelines but survival instructions. How the ranger who'd ignored them in '87 had been found dead 2 miles from the cabin, wearing nothing but underwear in a blizzard. What would happen if I looked directly at the tree? What was it waiting for me to see? I didn't want to find out. 10 yards away. The tree was moving more obviously now, like it was getting impatient. The trunk seemed to twist slightly, and I could swear the bark was shifting patterns. But I kept my focus on the trail, on the packed snow under my boots, on anything except the thing that was pretending to be a tree 50 feet from the path I walked every day. I passed it, kept walking, kept my eyes forward, kept the tree at the very edge of my peripheral vision as it fell behind me. I could feel it watching me go, could sense its attention like a weight on my back. Then, gradually, the feeling faded. I walked another 100 yards before I allowed myself to glance back. The tree was there, in what looked like its normal position, standing where it was supposed to stand, looking like it had always looked. The double fork was back to its familiar angle. The bark was the normal gray-brown of old pine trees. But I wasn't fooled. I finished my patrol route, checking the creek crossing and the eastern boundary markers like I always did. Everything else was normal. Standard forest stuff, a few deer tracks in the snow, some bird activity in the lower branches, the usual signs of winter wildlife trying to survive another cold day. When I circled back toward the cabin 2 hours later, I took a different trail, one that didn't pass anywhere near the big pine tree with the double fork. Back at the cabin, I made coffee and sat at my table with Mario's rules spread out in front of me. I read rule number 3 again, then rule number 4 about not touching old personal belongings found in the woods. Neither one was exactly what I'd encountered, but they were close enough. Don't look directly at things that are out of place. Don't interact with things that shouldn't be there. I thought about folding the paper and putting it back in my pocket, but instead I left it on the table. Maybe it was time to stop pretending I had this job figured out. Maybe it was time to admit that Mario's rules weren't paranoid superstitions from an old man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. Maybe they were the only thing keeping me alive out here. I finished my coffee and looked out the window toward the tree line. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, just another quiet afternoon in the forest. But I knew better now. I knew that normal was just a mask that things wore when they wanted you to let your guard down. And I knew that somewhere out there, a tree that wasn't really a tree was waiting for the next person to walk down that trail and make the mistake of looking directly at it. I wasn't going to be that person. I'd been working late again. The paperwork never seemed to end. Patrol logs, equipment inventories, maintenance reports that needed filing with the district office. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept drinking it anyway. The bitter taste helped me stay focused on the columns of numbers and dates that blurred together after staring at them too long. The computer screen cast a blue glow across the cabin's main room. Outside the windows, everything was black. No moon tonight, just the kind of deep winter darkness that made you forget there was a world beyond the tree line. I'd gotten used to the isolation, mostly. 3 months of living alone in the forest changes your relationship with silence. You learn to appreciate it instead of fighting it. I was updating the radio battery inventory when I heard it. Soft whistling drifted through the night air. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, hauntingly beautiful, with notes that seemed to hang in the cold air longer than they should. It rose and fell in patterns that felt familiar, but wrong, like a half-remembered song from childhood that you couldn't quite place. The sound made something in my chest tighten, not the warning tension I'd learned to recognize when the forest was trying to kill me. This was different. This was pleasant, inviting. The melody wrapped around my thoughts and made me want to hear more of it. I stopped typing and tilted my head toward the window. The whistling seemed to come from directly outside, maybe 20 feet from the cabin, close enough that whoever was making it had to be standing right at the edge of the clearing. But that didn't make sense. Nobody should be out there. Nobody even knew exactly where this station was except for the district office in Catherine, and she wouldn't be hiking through the forest at 11:30 at night. The melody shifted, becoming more complex. Harmonies layered underneath the main tune, creating depth that shouldn't have been possible from a single person whistling. It was the kind of music that made you think of summer evenings and fireflies, of being a kid again and feeling safe in your own backyard. Beautiful didn't begin to cover it. This was the most gorgeous sound I'd ever heard. I found myself pushing back from the desk. My legs moved without me deciding to move them. 3 steps toward the window, then 4. The whistling continued, and I wanted to get closer to it. Needed to get closer. Whoever was making this music, I had to see them. Had to thank them for bringing something so perfect into this cold, empty place. My hand reached for the window latch. That's when Mario's voice cut through the melody in my head. Rule number 5. The words came back to me like a slap of cold water. Immediately leave areas where music or laughter comes from empty spaces where people have gone missing. I jerked my hand back from the window. The whistling continued, but now it sounded different. Still beautiful, but wrong. Like honey poured over broken glass. The melody that had seemed so welcoming 30 seconds ago now felt hungry. Patient. It had been waiting for me to open that window, or maybe step outside to find its source. My heart started hammering. How long had I been walking toward the sound? How close had I come to opening that latch and sticking my head out into the night? The beautiful music kept playing, but I backed away from the window until my legs hit the desk chair. The district files. I'd read them during my first week, going through decades of incident reports to understand what kind of emergencies I might face. 7 people had gone missing in this area over the past 20 years. Hikers, mostly. A few hunters. They'd vanished without leaving tracks, without leaving gear behind, without leaving anything that would help explain where they had gone. The search teams had found nothing, not even bodies, empty spaces where people have gone missing. I shut down the computer without saving my work. The screen went black, and suddenly the cabin felt smaller, more vulnerable. The whistling continued outside, circling the building now. I could track its movement by sound. from the front window to the east wall, then around to the back where my bedroom was, then to the west side near the kitchen. Whoever or whatever was making it was walking the perimeter of my home. My emergency pack sat by the door where I always kept it. Sleeping bag, 3 days of food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, extra batteries for the radio. I grabbed it and slung the straps over my shoulders. The weight felt reassuring, solid, real. The car keys were on the hook by the door. I took them down and held them tight enough that the metal edges bit into my palm. The small pain helped me think clearly. I needed to leave. Right now. Not in 5 minutes. Not after I finished the inventory reports. Now. But the music was so beautiful. Part of my brain kept insisting that I was overreacting, that I should at least look outside to see what was making such gorgeous sounds. Maybe it was just a person, someone lost who was whistling to keep their spirits up. Maybe they needed help. I bit down on my tongue hard enough to taste blood. The sharp pain cut through the musical fog in my head. This was exactly how the thing got you. It made you want to help, made you think there was something wonderful waiting just outside your door, made you forget that the forest was full of things that wore familiar shapes to hide their teeth. The whistling grew louder as I approached the door, richer, more complex. Harmonies built on harmonies until it sounded like a whole choir was surrounding the cabin. But I could still tell it was coming from one source, moving in a slow circle around the building. One thing that could make the sounds of many. I turned the deadbolt as quietly as I could. The click seemed loud as a gunshot in the small room. The whistling paused for just a moment, then resumed. But now there was something different in the melody. Something that sounded like amusement. It knew I was leaving, and it thought that was funny. I opened the door fast and stepped out into the cold. The temperature hit me like a physical blow. Had to be 20 below, maybe worse. My breath came out in white clouds that froze and fell to the ground. The whistling surrounded me now, coming from the trees on all sides. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel something watching me. Multiple somethings, maybe. My truck sat 15 feet away, 15 feet of open ground where I'd be completely exposed. The whistling grew more insistent, more beautiful, inviting me to stop walking and just listen for a while, to appreciate the artistry of what I was hearing. I ran. The snow crunched under my boots as I sprinted to the truck. Behind me, the whistling changed pitch, becoming higher, more urgent, like it was calling me back, like it was disappointed that I wasn't staying to enjoy the show. I yanked the driver's door open and threw myself inside. The emergency pack landed on the passenger seat with a thud. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over on the second try, and I'd never been so grateful to hear the rough idle of an old Ford pickup. The headlights cut through the darkness as I backed out of the clearing. For just a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving between the trees. Tall, thin figures that swayed in rhythm with the music. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there except empty forest. I put the truck in drive and headed for the main road. The whistling followed me. That was the part that made my skin crawl. As I drove down the narrow Forest Service road, the music kept pace with the truck. It came from the trees on both sides, moving along with me at 30 miles per hour. Sometimes it was closer, sometimes farther away, but it never fell behind, never faded into the distance like normal sound should. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. 40 miles per hour on a road that wasn't meant for anything over 25. The truck bounced and slid on the icy patches, but I didn't slow down. The whistling stayed with me, beautiful and patient and wrong. At 50 miles per hour, I hit a straight stretch and floored it. The speedometer climbed past 60. The music finally began to fade, growing softer and more distant. By the time I reached the main highway, I couldn't hear it anymore. But I kept driving anyway, 20 miles south to Clearwater, the nearest town that had a motel. The Pineview Inn sat right off the highway, a rundown place with 12 rooms and a neon sign that flickered between vacancy and vacancy. I'd driven past it dozens of times, but never thought I'd need it. The desk clerk looked surprised to see anyone at midnight. I paid cash for a room and didn't bother explaining why I needed it. He handed me a key attached to a plastic pine tree and pointed toward the back of the building. Room 7 smelled like cigarettes and industrial disinfectant. The carpet was orange and brown, probably from the 70s. The bed sagged in the middle, and the heater under the window made a rattling sound when it kicked on. It was the most beautiful place I'd ever seen. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what had happened. The whistling had been a trap, a lure, just like the voice that sounded like Stephen, just like the blue lights that had tried to pull me deeper into the forest. But this one had been different, more sophisticated. Instead of mimicking something familiar, it had created something new, something so beautiful that I'd wanted to walk toward it even when my rational mind knew better. How close had I come to opening that window? How close had I come to stepping outside and following the music into the trees? The thought made me sick to my stomach. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I heard echoes of that melody in my head. Even here, 20 miles away from the forest, part of me wanted to get in the truck and drive back. Wanted to hear the rest of the song. I left the motel at first light and drove back to the station. The forest looked normal in the daylight, just trees and snow and the kind of winter silence that felt clean instead of threatening. But as I pulled into the clearing, I could see that something had changed. Strange symbols were carved into the wood around the station's entrance, spirals and angular shapes that hurt my eyes to look at directly. They covered the door frame and extended up the walls on both sides, carved deep enough that I could see fresh wood underneath the dark stain. The marks were precise, deliberate. Someone or something had spent hours working on them while I was gone. I parked the truck but didn't get out right away. The symbols seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. My peripheral vision caught patterns that disappeared when I turned my head. Looking at them for more than a few seconds gave me a headache that felt like ice picks behind my eyes. This was a message. A warning, maybe, or a promise. The beautiful sound had been a trap, and leaving immediately had saved me from whatever had marked my station during the night. The thing that had tried to lure me out with music had carved its signature into my home. I finally got out of the truck and approached the door carefully. The symbols were even worse up close. They seemed to writhe and twist, forming patterns that my brain couldn't quite process. I had to look away every few seconds to keep from getting dizzy. The door was still locked. Whatever had done this hadn't tried to get inside. It had just wanted me to know that it had been here, that it knew where I lived, that next time maybe I wouldn't be smart enough to run. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly as I'd left it. Computer shut down, coffee cup still sitting on the desk, papers scattered where I'd abandoned them. But the air felt different, colder, like something had been breathing in here while I was gone. The beautiful sound had been a trap, and I'd almost walked right into it. I'd been pushing deeper into the eastern sector than usual, following deer trails that wound through stands of timber I'd never explored before. The snow was knee-deep here, untouched except for animal tracks, and the silence had that particular weight that comes with isolation. I'd been walking for 3 hours, marking my route on the GPS every quarter mile, when I saw the smoke. Just a thin gray line rising above the tree line, maybe half a mile ahead. I stopped and pulled out my binoculars, scanning the area where the smoke originated. Nothing on my maps showed any structures in this direction. Hell, nothing on my maps showed anything but wilderness for another 15 miles. I should have turned around right then, should have marked the coordinates and radioed it in from the cabin, But curiosity got the better of me, and I told myself it was probably just a hunting camp or maybe some old trapper's shack that hadn't made it onto the newer surveys. The deer trail I'd been following petered out after another quarter-mile, so I broke my own path through the snow. The trees here were old growth, massive spruces that had to be pushing 200 years. Their branches created a canopy so thick that even with most of the leaves gone, the forest floor felt dim and cathedral quiet. I kept following that smoke, checking my GPS every few minutes to make sure I could find my way back. The signal was getting weak this far out, but it was holding. The smoke never seemed to get closer, though. I'd walk for 10 minutes, and it still looked like it was half a mile ahead, rising in that same steady column. That should have been my second warning sign. By the time I finally saw the cabin, the afternoon sun was starting to angle low through the trees. I came around a massive spruce, and there it was, tucked into a grove of ancient trees like it had grown there naturally. The structure looked old but solid, built from hand-hewn logs that had weathered to a deep gray. The roof was steep-pitched to shed snow, and a stone chimney rose from one end, sending up that steady stream of smoke I'd been following. Warm yellow light glowed in 2 windows, the kind of light that comes from oil lamps or candles, not electric. The whole scene looked like something from a century ago, peaceful and inviting in a way that made you want to walk up and knock on the door. I stood there for a minute, taking it in. The cabin wasn't large, maybe 20 by 30 feet, but it looked well maintained. The logs were tight, the chinking looked fresh, and the windows had actual glass, not the plastic sheeting you sometimes saw on abandoned hunting camps. Someone was clearly living here, or at least using it regularly, but that raised questions I didn't like. This was federal land, and I'd never seen any permits for structures in this area. No mention of it in any of the reports Mario had left me. No indication on any map, including the detailed survey charts that showed every outhouse and lean-to for 50 miles in any direction. I checked my GPS again. The signal was down to 1 bar, but it still showed my position. According to the coordinates, I was standing in empty wilderness. The cabin didn't exist as far as the satellites were concerned. I approached slowly, my boots crunching in the snow. The sound seemed too loud in the silence, like it might disturb whatever peace existed in this place. As I got closer, I could see more details. The door was heavy wood, painted red but faded to a rust color. The windows had curtains drawn across them, but the light leaked around the edges, creating a warm glow that looked incredibly inviting after 3 hours of walking in the cold. My hand was already reaching for the door handle when something made me stop. Not a sound or a movement, just a sudden wrongness that hit me like cold water. I stood there with my arm extended, trying to figure out what had triggered that feeling. The smoke. I looked up at the chimney, watching that gray column rise straight into the air. Perfectly straight. No wavering, no dispersing. Just a clean line that went up about 30 feet and then seemed to disappear. But the wind was blowing. I could hear it in the treetops above me, a steady whisper that bent the branches and sent occasional snow cascades down from the higher boughs. My jacket was moving in the breeze, and I could feel it on my face, strong enough that it should have been pushing that smoke around, breaking it up, sending it sideways. The smoke rose straight up like the air was perfectly still. I stepped back from the door, my heart starting to pick up speed. Something was wrong here. I looked around more carefully, trying to spot what else wasn't right. The cabin looked solid and real, but now that I was paying attention, details started jumping out at me. No footprints. The snow around the cabin was pristine, several feet deep and unmarked except for my own tracks leading from the trees. No path to the door. No signs that anyone had walked around the building or brought in firewood or supplies. Nothing. Just perfect, undisturbed snow that looked like it had been falling for days. But someone was inside. Had to be, with that fire burning and those lights on. I pulled out my phone, thinking I'd try to get a photo, but the screen showed no signal at all now. The camera still worked though, so I snapped a few pictures of the cabin and the surrounding area. The phone felt colder than it should have, like it had been sitting in a freezer. That's when Mario's rules hit me like a physical blow. Rule number 6, the one about not letting suspicious people into the cabin or giving them information about my location and schedule. But this was the reverse situation. I wasn't being approached by someone suspicious. I was approaching them. I fumbled for the paper in my jacket pocket, my hands clumsy with cold and adrenaline. The rules felt warm against my fingers, warmer than they should have been. I didn't need to unfold them to remember what Mario had written. Don't answer voices in the dark. Don't investigate lights in the forest. Don't look directly at out-of-place objects. Don't touch old belongings found in the woods. Don't go where music comes from empty spaces. And don't trust people who show up where they shouldn't be. But what about places that show up where they shouldn't be? I looked at the cabin again, really looked at it. The light in the windows was steady, unflickering, like it came from electric bulbs rather than flames. But there were no power lines out here, no way to get electricity to a structure this remote. The smoke continued its impossible straight rise, and now that I was watching for it, I realized I couldn't smell it. Wood smoke has a distinct scent, especially in cold air. It should have been obvious from 50 feet away. I couldn't smell anything at all. The afternoon sun was hitting the cabin full on, bright enough that everything else in the grove cast sharp shadows on the snow. The trees, the rocks, even my own body threw dark lines across the white ground. The cabin cast no shadow at all. I stood there staring at the empty snow where the cabin's shadow should have been, feeling my mouth go dry. The building looked solid, real enough to touch, but the sun was shining right through it like it was made of glass, or like it wasn't really there. My hand was shaking when I raised the phone to take another picture. Through the camera screen, the cabin looked exactly the same, solid, real, inviting. But when I lowered the phone and looked with my naked eyes, I could see the wrongness everywhere. No shadow, no smell, no footprints, smoke that defied physics. I needed to get out of here. Now. I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the cabin. The lights in the windows seemed to pulse slightly, like whoever was inside had noticed my presence and was responding to it. The door looked like it might open at any second, and I had no idea what would come out, or what might try to invite me in. I'd made it maybe 20 feet when I heard the sound, not from the cabin, but from behind me. Footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, like someone was following my trail. I spun around, but the forest was empty. Just trees and shadows and the path I'd broken through the snow. But the footsteps continued. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Maintaining the same steady pace, getting closer. I looked back at the cabin. The lights in the windows were definitely pulsing now, faster and brighter. The door remained closed, but I could swear I saw movement behind the curtains. Shapes that might have been people, or might have been something else entirely. The footsteps behind me stopped. I turned around again, and this time I saw them. Footprints in the snow following my exact trail. But they weren't human prints, too long, too narrow, with what looked like claw marks at the front. The same kind of prints I'd found in the forest after the blue lights, and they led right up to where I was standing. I looked down at my feet. The prints stopped about 3 feet behind me, like whatever was making them had been following me and then just vanished, or was still there, invisible, waiting for me to make the wrong move. My GPS beeped, a low battery warning that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence. I pulled it out and saw that the screen was flickering, the coordinates jumping around like it couldn't get a fix on my position. 1 second it showed me in the middle of wilderness. The next it showed me somewhere that didn't exist on any map. I needed to mark this location, but the GPS was useless. I pulled out my compass instead, taking a bearing on the cabin and noting the position relative to the distinctive rock formation I'd passed about a quarter-mile back. Old-school navigation, the kind Mario had drilled into me during training. The compass needle was spinning. Not pointing north, not pointing anywhere, just rotating slowly in continuous circles like it couldn't find magnetic north. Like the normal rules of physics didn't apply in this place. That's when I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't just a cabin that shouldn't exist. This was something that existed outside the normal world entirely. Something that could appear solid and real and inviting while casting no shadow and leaving no trace. A trap. The most sophisticated trap I'd encountered yet. I started walking backward, keeping my eyes on the cabin while feeling behind me for obstacles. The footprints in the snow had vanished, but I could still sense something following me, matching my pace step for step. The lights in the cabin windows pulsed faster, and I thought I heard something that might have been voices calling from inside. Friendly voices, welcoming voices, the kind that would invite a cold, tired ranger in for coffee and warmth. I didn't listen to what they were saying. It took me 20 minutes to back out of the grove, and the whole time I felt like I was being watched by dozens of invisible eyes. The cabin remained visible until I was almost to the tree line, and then it started to fade, becoming translucent and finally disappearing entirely, like it had never been there at all. But I knew it was still there, waiting for the next person to follow the smoke and find the warm lights in the windows. I marked the location on my hand-drawn map when I got back to an area where the GPS worked again. Not the exact coordinates, but close enough that I could find the general area and avoid it. The compass started working normally as soon as I was half a mile away, pointing steadily north like nothing had happened. The walk back to the cabin took 4 hours, and I spent most of it thinking about what I'd almost done. I'd been ready to knock on that door, to walk right into whatever was waiting inside. If Mario's rules hadn't kicked in when they did, I might have ended up like those 7 missing people. Another unexplained disappearance in the forest, another case file with no answers. The sun was setting by the time I got back to my own cabin, the real one with its solid shadow and normal smoke that dispersed in the wind. I locked the door behind me and started a fire, needing the warmth and the familiar sound of real wood burning. I sat at the table with Mario's rules spread out in front of me, reading them again by lamplight. Rule 6 was about not trusting suspicious people who showed up where they didn't belong. But the principle was the same. Don't trust anything that appears where it shouldn't exist. The cabin in the grove was still out there, waiting for someone else to find it, someone who didn't have Mario's rules to warn them away. I spent the night going over my notes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The photos on my phone showed nothing but trees where the cabin had been. Just empty forest, like Catherine would find when we went back. 3 days later, she met me at the station with her gear packed and a skeptical look I recognized. Can't say I blamed her. Even I was starting to wonder if the isolation was getting to me. "You sure about the coordinates?" she asked, checking her GPS against mine. "Dead sure. Marked it twice on the way out." We made good time through the eastern sector. Catherine knew the trails better than I did, and she set a steady pace that ate up the miles without wearing us out. The snow had settled since my last trip, making the walking easier. I found myself watching her move through the forest, noting how she read the terrain and adjusted her route without thinking about it. Professional competence. It was reassuring to have someone else out here, someone who knew what they were doing. The deer trail was still visible where I'd followed it 3 days ago. My boot prints had filled in with fresh snow, but the path itself remained clear enough to follow. Catherine examined the trail markers I'd left on trees, nodding approval at my navigation technique. "Good spacing on these," she said. "Easy to follow back out." I didn't tell her I'd been more worried about finding my way back than usual. The cabin had done something to my equipment that day, made me doubt everything I thought I knew about the area. Having backup felt necessary in ways I couldn't explain to someone who hadn't been there. We reached the grove in just under 2 hours. I stopped at the tree line where I'd first spotted the cabin, scanning the clearing ahead. Nothing, just old-growth spruce in the natural hollow where the building had stood. The trees looked exactly the same, positioned in their perfect circle like they'd been growing there for centuries, which they probably had. "This is it?" Catherine asked. Yeah, the cabin was right there in the center. She walked into the grove without hesitation, checking her GPS and making notes. I followed more slowly, watching for any sign that something had been here. The snow was undisturbed except for our footprints. No foundation stones, no cleared area, no remnants of a chimney. Nothing to suggest a structure had ever existed in this spot. Catherine knelt down and brushed snow away from the ground, checking for disturbances in the soil. Ground's frozen solid, has been for weeks. If there was a building here recently, we'd see some evidence. Cleared area, foundation marks, something. I stood where the front door had been, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I remembered. The proportions were right. The spacing between the trees matched what I'd observed. But there was no cabin. Had never been a cabin, according to every piece of evidence except my memory. "Tell me again what you saw," Catherine said, pulling out her tablet to take notes. I went through it step by step. The smoke rising above the trees, the approach through the forest, the cabin itself, with its hand-hewn logs and warm yellow light, the wrongness I'd sensed when I reached for the door handle, the lack of footprints in the snow, the absence of wood smoke smell, the missing shadow. Catherine listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. Her expression stayed neutral, professional. When I finished, she looked around the grove again, then checked something on her tablet. "No structures reported in this area," she said. "I pulled the historical records before we came out. No homesteads, no hunting cabins, no forestry buildings. Nothing within 15 miles of these coordinates. I know how it sounds. Actually, it doesn't sound crazy. Weird, but not crazy." She stood up and brushed snow off her knees. "I've been working this territory for 8 years. Seen some things that didn't make immediate sense. Usually turned out to have explanations, but not always." That surprised me. Catherine had always struck me as purely practical, someone who dealt in facts and procedures. Hearing her acknowledge unexplained phenomena felt like validation. "You think I saw something real?" "I think you saw something. Whether it was real in the way we usually define real, that's a different question." She gestured at the grove around us. "But you navigated here accurately. Your GPS coordinates were precise. You described specific details about the location that match what we're seeing. The trees, the layout, the sight lines. You were definitely here." We spent another hour searching the area. Catherine was thorough, checking for any physical evidence that might explain what I'd experienced. She found my original boot prints from 3 days ago, partially filled but still visible in the deeper snow. The trail I'd broken through the forest was easy to follow back to where the deer path ended. "Your tracks are consistent with your story," she said. "You approached from the direction you described, spent time in this exact spot, then left the way you came. Timeline matches what you reported. But no cabin, no sign that anything unusual had happened here except for one ranger standing in an empty grove, staring at trees and trying to make sense of his own memory." On the hike back, Catherine asked about Mario's rules. I'd mentioned them in my report, though I hadn't gone into detail about how they'd guided my response to the cabin. "He really gave you a written list?" 6 rules, handwritten, folded up like he'd been carrying it for years. "Can I see it?" I pulled the paper from my jacket pocket and handed it to her. She read through the rules twice, walking slowly to avoid tripping while she studied Mario's careful handwriting. "This is specific," she said. "Not general wilderness safety. These are responses to particular types of encounters." "You think he was crazy?" "I think he was experienced. 30 years in this territory, most of it alone. If he wrote these down and carried them with him, he had reasons." She handed the paper back. The question is whether his reasons match what you're experiencing. I thought about the voice that had called my name in the dark, perfectly mimicking my brother. The blue lights that had lured me off the trail. The child-shaped figure standing motionless in pristine snow. The pine tree that had moved when I wasn't looking directly at it. The beautiful whistling that had compelled me toward the window until I'd forced myself to leave the station entirely. They match, I said. Then maybe the cabin was rule number 6, something that appeared where it didn't belong, trying to get you to trust it. That made sense in a way that bothered me. The cabin had felt wrong from the moment I'd gotten close to it, despite looking perfectly normal and inviting. The lack of footprints, the missing shadow, the straight rising smoke in windy conditions, all signs that it wasn't what it appeared to be. So what was it really? Don't know. Don't think I want to know. Catherine stopped walking and looked back toward the grove, though we were too far away to see it through the trees. But I'm glad you didn't go inside. We made it back to the station by late afternoon. Catherine spent another hour going through my reports from the past few months, cross-referencing my encounters with historical incident data. She found patterns that supported what I'd been experiencing. Missing persons reports cluster around this area, she said, pointing at locations on her map. 7 people in 20 years, like you mentioned. But there are also reports of strange sightings going back decades. Lights in the forest, voices calling for help, structures that appeared and disappeared. Other rangers? Hunters, mostly, hikers, people who came back with stories they couldn't explain. She closed her tablet and looked at me directly. People who followed the voices or investigated the lights usually didn't come back to report anything. That evening, after Catherine had driven back to her own station, I sat at my table with Mario's rules spread out in front of me. The paper looked more worn than it had a few months ago, creased from being folded and unfolded, handled during moments of uncertainty and fear. I understood now why Mario had carried these rules for 30 years. They weren't superstitions or paranoid delusions. They were survival instructions, written by someone who had learned the hard way how to coexist with things that shouldn't exist but did anyway. The cabin was still out there, waiting for the next person to follow smoke rising above the trees. Someone who didn't have Mario's warnings to guide them away from the door handle. I had the paperwork spread across the table when I heard the truck coming up the service road. 3 weeks early, but I'd been expecting this. The transfer request had gone through faster than I thought it would. Part of me was relieved. Another part wasn't sure I was ready to leave. The engine sound got closer, then cut off outside. I folded the transfer papers and slipped them into my jacket pocket, right next to Mario's rules. The paper had gotten soft from all the handling over the past year, worn thin at the creases where I'd opened it so many times in the dark. A car door slammed shut. Footsteps crunched through the snow toward the cabin. I stood up and straightened my uniform, checking the mirror by the door. Same routine Mario had gone through when I'd arrived. Felt like yesterday and a lifetime ago all at once. The knock came firm and professional. 3 sharp raps. "Come in," I called. The door opened and a young guy stepped inside, stomping snow off his boots, maybe 24, 25 years old. Clean-shaven, short blonde hair, bright eyes that took in everything at once. He had that eager look I remembered having when I'd first gotten here, back when I thought I knew what this job would be. "Dylan Wallace?" he asked, extending his hand. "That's me." I shook his hand, strong grip, confident. "You must be Collins. James Collins. Jim." He looked around the cabin, taking inventory. "Nice setup you've got here. It does the job." I gestured to the chair across from my table. "Coffee?" "Sure, thanks." I poured 2 cups from the pot I'd kept warm all morning. My hands were steady. That was good. I'd been wondering if they would be. Jim sat down and pulled out a notebook, flipping to a fresh page. So, what's the standard routine here? District office said you'd walk me through everything. I set his coffee in front of him and sat back down. 3 weeks of training, then you're on your own. Same as I got when I started. Sounds good. He clicked his pen. What's the patrol schedule like? Daily loops, eastern boundary, northern markers, creek crossings. I'll show you the routes. I sipped my coffee, watching him write. Radio checks every morning at 7. Supply runs twice a month, standard stuff. Jim nodded, making notes. Any problem areas? Poaching, illegal camping, that kind of thing? Some. We'll cover all that during training. I paused, thinking about how to approach this. There's other things too, things that aren't in the manual. He looked up from his notebook. What kind of things? I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out Mario's rules. The paper felt warm, like it always did. I unfolded it carefully and set it on the table between us. My predecessor gave me this on his last day. Now I'm giving it to you. Jim leaned forward and read the first rule. His eyebrows went up slightly. Then he read the second one. By the time he got to the third rule, he was frowning. Is this some kind of joke? He asked. I'd been expecting that question, had asked it myself, sitting in the same chair a year ago. No joke. Don't answer voices calling your name in the dark. Jim read aloud. Come on, man. What is this? Summer camp ghost stories? I thought the same thing when Mario gave it to me. I kept my voice level, matter of fact. Figured he'd been out here too long. 30 years in the wilderness, you know. Maybe it got to him. Jim was still reading. Don't investigate unexplained lights moving through the forest at night. Don't look directly at out-of-place objects during new moons. He looked up at me. This is crazy. Yeah, that's what I thought too. So why are you showing it to me? I took another sip of coffee, buying time to find the right words. How do you explain a year of impossible things to someone who hasn't lived it yet? How do you make someone understand that normal logic doesn't apply out here? Because it works, I said finally. These rules kept me alive for a year. Jim laughed. Not mean, just disbelieving. Alive? What, from forest spirits? From things that shouldn't exist but do anyway. The laugh died on his face. He studied my expression, looking for signs I was pulling his leg. You're serious. Dead serious. He looked back at the paper. Don't touch old personal belongings found in woods. Only mark and report locations. Don't enter areas where music or laughter comes from empty spaces where people have gone missing. He shook his head. This sounds like paranoid delusions. I know how it sounds. Have you actually... He gestured vaguely. I mean, have you seen anything? I thought about the voice that had circled my cabin for 6 hours, calling my name in my brother's voice. The blue lights that had tried to lure me deeper into the forest. The child in the red coat standing motionless in pristine snow. The pine tree that had moved when I wasn't looking directly at it. The whistling that had driven me from the station in the middle of the night. The cabin that had appeared where no cabin should exist. Yes, I said. I've seen things. Jim waited for me to elaborate. When I didn't, he tapped the paper with his pen. What kind of things? The kind that make these rules necessary. That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give you. I met his eyes. Look, I could tell you stories. About voices in the dark and lights in the forest. About things that look human, but aren't. But you wouldn't believe me. Just like I didn't believe Mario. Try me. I shook my head. Doesn't work that way. You have to experience it yourself before it makes sense. But by then, if you don't have these rules... I tapped the paper. Well, let's just say there's a reason they exist. Jim was quiet for a long moment, reading through the rules again. So what? I'm supposed to just follow these blindly, Don't question anything. Don't investigate anything unusual. That's exactly what you're supposed to do. But I'm a park ranger. My job is to investigate unusual things. Your job is to survive your first year. Everything else is secondary. He set down his pen and leaned back in his chair. This is insane. Yeah, it is. You really expect me to believe that there are supernatural forces in this forest that require special rules to avoid? I thought about that question. About everything I'd learned over the past year. About the chain of knowledge that stretched back decades, passed from one ranger to the next. About Peterson, who'd given the rules to Mario in 1973. About the ranger in '87 who'd ignored them and died for it. I don't expect you to believe anything, I said. I expect you to follow the rules. Belief will come later, whether you want it to or not. Jim picked up the paper again, holding it like it might bite him. How long have these been around? Mario got them from his predecessor in '73. Peterson. Don't know who Peterson got them from. So this has been going on for decades? At least. And every ranger who's worked this station has followed these rules? The ones who survived, yeah. That got his attention. What do you mean, the ones who survived? I told him about the ranger in '87, found dead 2 miles from the cabin, wearing only underwear in a blizzard. How he'd been known to ignore the rules, thought they were superstitious nonsense. Jim's face had gone pale by the time I finished. Jesus. The rules aren't suggestions, I said. They're survival instructions. Written by people who learned the hard way what happens when you don't follow them. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the paper. I could see him trying to process it all, trying to fit it into his understanding of how the world worked. I remembered that feeling. The cognitive dissonance of being told something impossible was not only possible but necessary. So, what am I supposed to do? He asked finally. Just accept that there are monsters in the forest. You're supposed to follow the rules. Don't question them, don't test them, don't try to rationalize them. Just follow them exactly as written. For how long? Until you understand why they exist. Then you'll follow them because you want to live. Jim folded the paper and held it in his hands. This is crazy. Yeah, but it's also true. How do I know you're not just messing with me? Some kind of hazing ritual for new rangers? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the forest. The trees stood silent in the afternoon light, their branches heavy with snow. Beautiful and peaceful. Nothing to suggest the things that moved between them when darkness fell. You don't know, I said. You'll have to take it on faith until you learn for yourself. And if I don't follow the rules? I turned back to face him. Then you'll find out why they exist. And that knowledge might be the last thing you ever learn. Jim was quiet again, turning the paper over in his hands. I could see him wrestling with it, trying to decide if I was crazy or telling the truth. Part of me hoped he'd figure it out before something forced the lesson on him. Another part knew he wouldn't. Nobody ever did. Mario told me the same things I'm telling you, I said. Word for word, probably. I thought he was nuts. Figured 30 years in isolation had gotten to him. I was wrong. What changed your mind? The first time I almost broke rule number 1, when something called my name in the dark, using my brother's voice. I had my hand on the door handle before I remembered what Mario had told me. Jim's eyes widened slightly. Something was actually out there. Something was out there, and it knew my name, knew my brother's voice well enough to mimic it perfectly. Spent 6 hours trying to get me to open that door. What would have happened if you had? I don't know, and I never want to find out. Jim looked down at the rules again. 6 rules. That's it? That's it. 6 simple rules that will keep you alive if you follow them. 6 rules that will get you killed if you ignore them. And you followed them for a whole year? Every single day. Sometimes it was hard. Sometimes my instincts told me to do the opposite. but I followed them anyway. Even when you didn't understand why? Especially when I didn't understand why. Jim nodded slowly. I could see him starting to accept it, even if he didn't fully believe it yet. The same process I'd gone through, the same process every ranger probably went through when they inherited this knowledge. "What about the district office?" he asked. "Do they know about this?" "They know rangers sometimes report unusual incidents. They file the reports and don't ask too many questions. Been going on for decades. And they just accept that. They accept that this is a remote posting with a high turnover rate. Rangers transfer out after a year or two. Sometimes they quit the service entirely. The ones who stay tend to be the ones who learn to follow the rules." Jim was quiet for a moment, processing. How many people know about this? The rangers who've worked this station. Maybe a few others in similar postings. It's not the kind of thing you talk about at district meetings. Why not? Because normal people think you're crazy when you tell them, and crazy people don't get to keep their jobs. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "So I'm supposed to keep this secret? You're supposed to keep yourself alive. Everything else is optional." Jim stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the same view I'd been staring at moments before. It looks so normal. It is normal most of the time, but when it's not, I shrugged. That's when the rules matter. How often does stuff happen? Hard to say. Sometimes weeks go by with nothing. Sometimes things happen 3 nights in a row. There's no pattern I could figure out. But it definitely happens? Oh yeah, it definitely happens. Jim turned back to me. "And you're leaving because?" "Because I've done my time. Learned what I needed to learn. Now it's someone else's turn." "Where are you going?" "Transfer to a station closer to civilization, somewhere with cell phone coverage and regular human contact." I smiled. "Somewhere the weirdest thing I'll deal with is drunk campers and illegal fireworks." "And you're okay with just leaving, knowing what's out here?" I thought about that, about the responsibility I was passing on to him, about the knowledge that had been passed to me, about the chain of survival that stretched back decades. "I'm okay with it, because I'm giving you the same chance Mario gave me. The same chance Peterson gave Mario. The rules work, Jim. They'll keep you alive if you let them. And if I don't follow them, then you'll become another cautionary tale for the next guy." Jim sat back down and picked up the rules again. "I need to copy these down." I shook my head. "No copies. One sheet of paper, passed from ranger to ranger. That's how it's always been. What if I lose it?" "Don't lose it. What if something happens to it? Then you better hope you've memorized it by then." Jim stared at the paper like it was a live snake. "This is a lot of responsibility." "Yeah, it is." "What if I mess up? What if I forget one of the rules at the wrong moment? Then you learn why the rule exists. Hopefully you survive the lesson. That's not very reassuring. It's not supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to keep you alive." Jim folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "How do I know when to pass these on?" "You'll know. When your replacement shows up, you'll understand what Mario felt when he gave them to me. What I'm feeling right now." "Which is?" I thought about it. "Responsible, worried, hopeful that you'll be smart enough to listen. And if I'm not, then the next ranger will get a different kind of education about why the rules exist." Jim was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. I could see him trying to wrap his head around it all. The weight of the knowledge he'd just inherited. The responsibility of staying alive in a place where normal rules didn't apply. "Any other advice?" he asked finally. "Keep the rules with you always. Don't try to rationalize them or find logical explanations. When something weird happens, and it will happen, remember that Mario warned you. Remember that I warned you. And follow the rules exactly as written. That's it. That's it. The rules are all you need. Everything else you'll figure out as you go." Jim stood up and extended his hand. "Thank you. I think." I shook his hand. "You'll understand someday. When you're sitting in this chair passing the rules to your replacement, you'll understand exactly what this moment means." "I hope so." "You will. If you follow the rules, you will." I walked him to the door and watched him get into his truck. He sat there for a moment, engine running, staring at the cabin, probably wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Same thing I'd done a year ago. He drove away slowly, carefully navigating the Forest Service road. I stood in the doorway until his tail lights disappeared through the trees. The cabin felt different with him gone, emptier, like something had shifted. I'd carried Mario's knowledge for a year, and now it belonged to someone else. The chain continued, unbroken. I went back inside and started packing my gear. Didn't take long. A year in the wilderness teaches you to travel light. I left the radio equipment, the emergency supplies, the maintenance tools, everything the next ranger would need. But I kept one thing, a small notebook where I'd written down my experiences. Not the official reports I'd filed with the district office, but the real story. The truth about what happened out here. Someday, maybe someone would need to know. Someone would need to understand that the rules weren't just superstition or paranoia. They were survival instructions, written in the blood and fear of everyone who'd learned to coexist with the impossible. I locked the cabin and got in my truck. The engine started on the first try, and I pulled away from the station without looking back. The forest watched me go, silent and patient. It would be here when Jim arrived for his first real shift. It would test him the way it had tested me, the way it had tested everyone who'd worked this posting. Some people weren't meant for places like this. Some people couldn't handle the knowledge that the world was bigger and stranger than they'd ever imagined. But some people could adapt. Some people could learn to follow rules that made no sense until they saved your life. I hoped Jim was one of the latter, for his sake, and for the sake of whoever would come after him. The rules would continue to pass from hand to hand, ranger to ranger, as long as people were willing to work this station. As long as there were people brave enough or desperate enough to take a job in the middle of nowhere, watching over a forest that watched back. I drove toward civilization, carrying the weight of what I'd learned and the responsibility of what I'd passed on. The rules were Jim's problem now. My job was done.